Hello and welcome back to Lean on Success, where process improvement is self-improvement. My name is Ben. I'm a Lean Six Sigma Master Black Belt, and today we're going to talk about how Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, is intentionally causing a recession. Before we get into that though, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Now, in order to explain exactly why the Fed is crashing our economy, we need to take a little bit of a macroeconomics lesson. There's an equation in macroeconomics that I'm going to be reviewing as part of this video. The equation is M times V equals P times Q. Let's break that down. The M stands for the money supply. This is the total amount of cash and assets available to make purchases in the United States. The V stands for velocity. This refers to the speed that money is flowing through the economy. You can look at V as a good way of measuring the amount of spending or consumer demand that exists in the economy. The P stands for price. Now, we lean on the CPI to give us a good index of what prices are doing, just as I reviewed in a previous video. And the Q stands for quantity or supply. It's the amount of goods that are being produced or available. Now, one thing to note is that the right side of this equation, sometimes called the supply side, price times quantity, is a good estimation of our GDP. That's going to become important here in a minute. Now, just to review, GDP stands for gross domestic product. It is the sum of all goods and services produced by a country over a given time period. Now, we know what we've covered in previous videos is that 2 consecutive quarters of a negative GDP, in other words, the economy shrinking for 2 consecutive quarters, is a good indication that a recession is occurring. So it's important for us to remember that a decrease in GDP is an indication that the country is going through or about to go through a recession. Another term I want to review with you is called the commutative property. The commutative property basically states anything that you do to the left side of an equation also has to be done to the right side of the equation in order to keep both things equal. So for example, if the money supply and the demand go up, that means that your GDP or your price times your quantity would also have to go up to match it. Now let's talk about the relationship between demand and prices. Now we know from basic economics that if demand, in this case represented by the V or velocity, if that goes up, that also drives prices up. Now let's talk about the relationship between price and supply. So we know that if the quantity or the supply of a product goes down, that also drives the price up. Let's talk about the economic forces that were at play at the start of the pandemic. Because of the shutdowns that occurred, that significantly pulled down the velocity of money. It decreased significantly. We couldn't go anywhere, couldn't go to restaurants, traveling was very difficult, etc. What we saw was that it pulled the entire GDP down. Money is slowing down. Supply is drying up significantly because a lot of people are shut down or aren't able to work, aren't able to produce things. And as a result, prices also fell with it, and the overall GDP went down as a result. This is where the Federal Reserve comes into play. Now, I can assure you that prior to the pandemic, nobody even knew who Jerome Powell was. People barely knew what the Federal Reserve was. Anytime the country is diving into recession, a lot of attention gets focused on the Federal Reserve, and there's a lot of expectation for intervention to occur. People look to the Federal Reserve as the primary means of pulling the country out of recession. So why is the Federal Reserve so critical in impacting the economy? So what the Fed does is anytime that there are wild abnormalities in the economic forces that are driving the economy, the Fed has different levers they can pull that manipulates the consumer side, or the demand side of that equation, the M times V part. They accomplish this through something called quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is done in two ways. Firstly, it's done via money printing, which we saw this through direct stimulus payments that were paid to Americans, as well as buying up a bunch of bank assets to give the banks more money to lend and to spend. The Fed also controls the federal funds rate. And during this last recession, the federal funds rate was manipulated down to a near zero rate, which allowed for even more money to flow more freely in the economy. What we can see on this chart as we look at the federal funds rate from 2009 until 2021, which is a year after the pandemic started, you see that prior to the pandemic, the federal funds rate was hovering around 2.5%. You can see, though, that once the recession set in from COVID, you see that the Federal Reserve very drastically reduced that funds rate down to near zero as a way of putting more money and allowing money to flow more freely into the economy. In addition to that, we saw an unprecedented amount of stimulus payments made directly to Americans. There were 3 rounds starting in March of 2020 and ending in March of 2021, totaling more than $800 billion of money that just appeared out of nowhere. So when you have a near zero funds rate that's allowing money to flow quickly, and you've got a whole lot more money flowing very quickly, this is what happens to your money supply. As you see here, during the first year of the pandemic, the money supply in the United States jumped by more than 25%. That's $4 trillion of money that was added to the economy during the first year of the pandemic. It's an unprecedented hockey stick when you look at the historical money supply. There were a whole lot of different unprecedented things that were happening. And the Fed's response to that was unprecedented times call for unprecedented measures. The problem is those unprecedented measures had unprecedented consequences. Let's go back to our equation, MV equals PQ, and let's overlay all of the different factors that we've discussed up to this point, along with some correlating consequences that also happen at the same time. You had all your stimulus payments. We just went over them. $800 billion got pumped into the economy basically overnight. We also see that the velocity of money sped up quickly because the low interest rates allow for money to be passed along at a much faster rate than it was before. While all of these forces were happening on the demand side, you also see issues on the supply side. You've heard by now about the chip shortage that occurred with automobile manufacturing that caused new car supply to dry up basically overnight. We saw that there are a lot of challenges in terms of food, specifically with egg shortages that drove the price of eggs up dramatically. And also we see that housing inventory basically dried up because the housing market became red hot during the pandemic. So you have all of these arrows on the demand side that are shooting way up like they never have before. And you've got multiple problems on the supply side that's pulling your supply, your quantity way down. When both of these things happen at the same time, that's how you get hyperinflation. So you can see from an economic standpoint, all of the actions that the Fed was taking that were happening concurrently to all of the supply chain issues we had across multiple different industries, it created a perfect storm for prices to just rampage out of control. And during the pandemic, we saw the highest inflation rates since the 80s. In an earlier video, I talked about how the prices of goods are 15% higher today than they were 2 years ago. And you can see now with all of those different economic forces working against us, why prices went out of control. So once again, we've encountered an unprecedented situation from an inflation standpoint. So what does the Fed do? They take more unprecedented actions. So I imagine that Jerome Powell took one look at all these figures and said, economy is too hot, baby. Got to sell some assets, got to raise interest rates. Remember how I said that the federal funds rate was driven down to near zero at the start of the pandemic? Well, look what happened to it as inflation started to rise out of control. The Fed Reserve took very drastic actions by rapidly increasing the federal funds rate. They not only took it back to the level it was prior to the pandemic, the federal funds rate actually was raised above 5% for the first time since before the great financial crisis. We also now see that they're reversing course in terms of quantitative tightening. Fed is now sucking money out of the economy to try to cool this inflation down. In fact, you even see that there has been an unprecedented decrease in the amount of the money supply. We've talked about two of the triggers that caused the Federal Reserve to jump into action and take unprecedented actions. The first one is when we're on the brink of recession or when we're in a recession. The second one is when inflation starts to really get out of control. There's one more factor that really triggers the Federal Reserve and signals to them what actions they should take, and that's the unemployment rate. Now, in economics, as a general rule, there's an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. So if inflation goes up, unemployment tends to go down. If unemployment goes up, the inflation tends to go down. Understanding that relationship is important because the Fed is looking to the job numbers and what's happening with unemployment to determine how much harder they should try to fight inflation. Now, as we look at the unemployment rate since World War II ended, we see that right now, the United States has an unemployment rate of 3.4%. This is the lowest unemployment rate that we have seen since the end of the Korean War in the early 50s. There's two takeaways from that. The first one is when you see something that hasn't happened in 70 years, there's no way that's sustainable. We can't keep up this employment rate forever. The second takeaway is as long as the Fed sees that unemployment continues to be low, that's basically a green light for them to continue all the actions they're taking to attack inflation. There's no reason for them to stop raising interest rates and to stop contracting the money supply because they're not yet seeing an adverse effect on job losses. This is what the Fed wants to accomplish with all of the quantitative tightening that they're doing. They want to sell off assets at a continued rate. They want to suck money out of the economy and cool it down. And they want to continue to push up higher interest rates. What they're hoping to accomplish is that this will then pull the prices down. Because again, you're decreasing the left side of the equation, trying to influence a decrease on the right side of the equation, in this case, lower inflation. Now, what they anticipate, as I just said earlier, is this continued tightening is going to result in some job losses. Because again, unemployment has been at its lowest in 70 years. That's not sustainable. The Fed understands that there's going to be an increase in unemployment. They're trying to minimize that damage. Now, because this economic balance is so difficult and is such a tightrope, the Fed also understands that this continued tightening is likely going to end up in what they are referring to as a mild recession. The economy is going to go into a mild recession as things continue to slow down and as those minor job losses, or at least what they think will be minor job losses, start to pile up. So in summary, the government sees that inflation has been rampaging out of control, but simultaneously has seen how strong the job market is, at least according to the numbers that they report. The government doesn't see any way out of this situation except to continue to suck money out of the system and raising interest rates. That will absolutely bring down prices and cool off the inflation, but it's also going to pull us into recession. So I want you to pay very close attention to the headlines as we move forward. I've already mentioned in earlier videos how the government is lying to us about the incoming recession because they know that they're driving us directly into it. Did you find any of this interesting? Did I completely bore you to death? Did I get something terribly wrong? Let me know down in the comments and share this video with your friends. Until next time.